All right, so as gas prices continue to sit at near record highs right now, we've seen a handful of policy proposals that have been put forward in the last couple of weeks in an effort to deliver material relief to the American people to help them deal with this inflation. And I wanted to get into one of the recent ones that I've seen that was a major one that's being put forward by Democrats right now, and get into the details of it, see if it falls short, and discuss whether or not it even has a chance at passing at all. So I've talked about on this channel that I think we should just straight up nationalize the entire energy system, and I'll get into my explanations for that. But let's just go ahead and get into this great breakdown here from Faj Shakir on how big oil is making billions of dollars, and he says let's tax it and give the money to the people. So he says Democrats in Congress want to pass a windfall profits tax and send the money to Americans via stimulus checks. Well, most Democrats, that is. Okay, so here are some of the details. They say Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and a dozen of his colleagues announced on March 10th that they were introducing legislation that would impose a windfall profits tax on oil companies, and there's also a House companion, and if it's enacted, a quarterly tax would be applied to large oil companies that produce or import at least 300,000 barrels of oil per day. And the senators estimate that when oil is at $120 a barrel, the tax would generate $45 billion in revenue, which would then translate to $360 stimulus checks for American families. So an absolutely insane amount of money that they are essentially robbing the American people of right now via their price gouging schemes that we've seen all of the major oil companies engaging in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So they continue saying the bill is fundamentally moderate in important ways. As already mentioned, it's paid for. Second, it isn't as comprehensive as many of us would like. It only targets windfalls gleaned from oil companies in their most recent profit taking, not from the hundreds of billions that they've reaped in recent years during the pandemic. And lastly, the amount is modest, a per barrel tax of half the difference between the current price of a barrel of oil and the pre-pandemic average price per barrel. Therefore, it concedes that oil companies will continue to make profits, just fewer profits. So again, an argument that I would make for just nationalizing the entire oil industry or the entire energy system as a whole, because this should not be one of those industries that is run for profits, or the consequences of that are going to be Americans essentially paying higher prices at the gas pump so that these wealthy, big oil CEOs can deliver fatter paychecks to themselves and other executives, as well as dividends to shareholders, as well as stock buybacks that inflate their stock prices and screwing over working class Americans in the process. It's just complete nonsense. We should use the resources that are available here in the United States for the benefit of the American people, not for the benefit of multinational corporations whose only interest is in maximizing profits at the expense of the rest of the country. So he continues saying that the current price gouging by oil companies is obscene, and he says take a look at the facts. Historically, when the price of crude oil was at the same levels it currently is, roughly $100 a barrel, the price of gas was actually $1 cheaper per gallon at the pump. So the difference here in that dollar is essentially just gas companies deciding we want to make up some of the profits that we lost out on during the pandemic when less people were buying gas, and we're basically just going to put that directly on the backs of the American people, using inflation as an excuse to just artificially jack up their prices to make more profits. And he says, and we know that when gas prices rise, the most painful burdens are felt obviously by working class people living paycheck to paycheck. And he says big oil hates the new proposal for obvious reasons. The American Petroleum Institute, the lobbying arm for oil companies, complained in a press conference that the bill is unfair finger pointing. Like finger pointing, seriously. As if these companies are not directly responsible for the problem at hand. Yes, we should be pointing fingers directly at these corporations who are literally verifiably price gouging the American people. I mean, all you have to do is go and look at their investor calls and see what they're saying to investors. They're saying we are able, due to the narrative of inflation that we have been seeing recently, we are able to jack up our prices purely for the sake of our shareholders. That's what they're saying openly. So this isn't some conspiracy. It isn't just unfairly targeting the big oil CEOs. Okay, cry me a fucking river. But, this is who we should be pointing the finger at, right? If anybody deserves finger pointing, it's you and the corrupt politicians like Senator Joe Manchin, who is a prominent defender of the fossil fuel industry, who echoed that he worries about beating people up. Okay, of course, Senator Joe Manchin, a literal millionaire coal baron who already eviscerated all of the major climate change aspects that were within Biden's Build Back Better Act, now is worried about beating people up, meaning going too hard against these precious, oil CEOs that donate record record amounts to his campaign, okay? Joe Manchin, by the way, is the single largest recipient of big oil and fossil fuel money to his campaign coffers. So, of course, he's going to be leading the charge in this effort. But, not surprising there. Now, he says, to its credit, the White House is leaning into this fight, partially, mostly with just, rhetoric, but President Joe Biden stated plainly that oil and gas companies shouldn't pad their profits at the expense of hardworking Americans. And at a recent press conference, Press Secretary Jen Psaki attacked oil and gas's windfall profits by explaining that too many of these companies, in our view, are making the calculated decision of returning money to investors and shareholders through buybacks and dividends. Translation: oil companies are enriching wealthy investors by sucking dollars out of the pockets of working people. So again, if you understand this context, then your answer to this should be, let's not let private for-profit corporations who only serve their shareholders, let's not let them determine the entire energy system within the United States. We should maybe nationalize our energy system so that we can operate it for the benefit of working class Americans instead of for the benefit of multinational corporations who could give a fuck about what gas prices are as long as they are able to engage in stock buybacks and payouts to shareholders. That's all they care about. So of course they're not going to help out the American people in a situation like this. They're going to use a situation like this with the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and the narrative of inflation to screw over the American people as much as possible. That's all they fucking care about. But again, this is mostly just rhetoric. Now, he posted this on Twitter saying oil prices are decreasing, gas prices should too. Last time oil was at $96 a barrel, gas was at $3.62 a gallon, now it's at $4.31. Oil and gas companies shouldn't pad their profits. And he posted this graph. Now, this is a really useful graph, right? I know I'm cutting off a little bit of it here, but this is a really useful graph because it does show that when the international market has a spike in energy prices, right, which is also artificial, by the way, this is due to, oil cartels like OPEC, and that involves like Saudi Arabia and Russia, as well as the United States. This is all just private corporations or, states basically like Russia and Saudi Arabia that own the oil industry, have an essential monopoly control over the entire oil global supply, and they are artificially restricting that supply in order to keep prices high. So even when we're talking about, barrels being as high as like in the 90s or, $100 a barrel, that's also artificial, right? It's not because of some inherent limitation on how much oil exists in the world, or it's not because of some inherent limitation in terms of how much we are theoretically able to release into the market. The reason why they want to keep these prices high is because that's how they make their fucking money. So of course, they're not going to actually reach the full potential of our energy production capabilities that would otherwise be possible. This is all artificially created as a problem. So, when you post a graph like this and you point out that there's a discrepancy between, gas prices staying high up here, even though the crude oil prices have gone down, well, that shouldn't be your only commentary because, yeah, this is displaying some sort of a difference here, and difference is essentially just purely profits for these oil companies. So it is accurate to call that out, but this isn't the only problem, because the problem here is, again, this international oil market that is controlled by petrostate dictators like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and Vladimir Putin in Russia, and U.S. multinational corporations like Chevron and Exxon and Shell that are essentially keeping this artificially high in the first place. So if you nationalize our entire oil industry and operated it on behalf of the American people, and instead of just allowing these multinational corporations to sell it on the international market for their own benefit instead of to the benefit of the American people, then you would have a better situation if you nationalize this industry. But of course, he doesn't make that broader argument here. He just points out the more limited discrepancy that we've seen recently, which again is fair, but this is just rhetoric, right? What are you actually going to do about it? Now, when it comes to the specific policy of a windfall tax, you can see here in the data that recent polling shows incredible 80% of U.S. voters support this windfall tax. Now, here from a Jake Johnson, he points out some of the details. New survey data out this week shows that U.S. voters, regardless of party affiliation, importantly, overwhelmingly support a windfall profits tax on U.S. oil corporations that are using Russia's war on Ukraine to hike prices at the gas pump. And he says, according to polling results released by the League of Conservation Voters, 80% of U.S. voters, including 73% of Republicans, support placing a windfall tax on the extra profits oil companies are making from the higher gasoline prices that they are charging because of the Russia-Ukraine situation. And more broadly, 87% of U.S. voters want Congress and Joe Biden to crack down on price gouging and excessive price increases by oil companies that result in higher gas prices at the pump. So you see, 90% virtually of the American people are begging Joe Biden or Congress to do something to crack down on these clearly corrupt and exploitative oil companies. That's what the American people want Joe Biden to do. And instead of actually doing something concrete about it, he's busy, tweeting on his phone, or his staffers are busy tweeting from his account as if like that's going to solve the problem. That's not going to do anything material. Now, if you did go on a relentless pressure campaign, not only at the corporations and call them out directly, point out their profit margins, point out the stock buybacks and the dividends they're delivering to shareholders, point out all of that data, go on an all-out offensive and call on them to lower their prices, maybe that'll have some sort of an effect. But again, at the end of the day, the lesson here is nationalize the industry. We shouldn't be beholden to these capitalist enterprises that are just purely acting on behalf of their shareholders and their profit margins at the expense of the rest of the country. That's not how we should be operating. So, that's the fundamental question that is at stake here. And I think that's something you could make a positive argument that would be extremely popular. And it seems like they understand the arguments here, right? You heard it from Jen Psaki, you heard it from Biden himself. They understand that 90% or 80% of the American people are on their side. Why would you not go the full length to take on this fight? Now, it's not even in the question right now of nationalizing our energy production. That's not even something that's being brought up in any serious capacity by members of Congress or anything like that. But even on this one policy, right? You see already he's facing pushback from guys like Joe Manchin within his own party. So it's already a question of whether or not this would even be able to get passed realistically at all, let alone even get passed if there wasn't a filibuster that existed. So you still have guys like Joe Manchin, who again is just a massively corrupt oil baron or a coal baron in West Virginia, and he's already coming out and saying, oh, you're bullying the CEOs, you're bullying these poor fossil fuel corporations that funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars into my campaign coffers. So he's already coming out against this. Now, again, the lesson here is Joe Biden, you either have to take on this fight with Joe Manchin directly and call out his own corruption and call out the fossil fuel industry and go full speed in that direction in order to try to get a policy like this passed. But even that wouldn't go far enough in my opinion. But the lesson here is, at the end of the day, keep pushing for nationalization for multiple different reasons, not just to keep prices low or to help the American people, but on top of that, to help facilitate the transition away from fossil fuels. Because if we have our entire energy system, as it has been, controlled in an authoritarian manner by capitalist enterprises who only care about their profits and their shareholders, well, that's not going to facilitate any sort of an ability to transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. And that's what we have to do right now as aggressively as possible in order to avert some of the most disastrous consequences that are inevitably going to come as a result of climate change. So those are the arguments for nationalization, or at the very bare minimum, get out there, Joe Biden, use this as an opportunity to bolster your absolutely tanking approval ratings, and go out there and actually fight for the American people and deliver something material that they could feel in their wallets.